Welcome to our deep dive, into human rights. And given your background, in philosophy, I
Yeah.
think you'll find this one particularly interesting because it's one of those concepts I feel like we all sort of take for granted. But once you start digging a little deeper, there's so many fascinating philosophical questions that kind of emerge.
It is true. Human rights are really at the intersection of, you know, law, morality, and politics. And that makes for a very rich philosophical discussion.
Yeah, I mean, on the surface, you could say, oh, human rights, they're rights that humans have. But then you start asking, well, what makes them rights? Where do they come from? How do we justify them? And suddenly you're in the middle of like a huge philosophical, deep dive.
Exactly. And that's what we'll be exploring today. And luckily, we have some very good sources that talk about this very topic,
Hmm.
one of which being the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which has a great deal of information about human rights.
Perfect. Yeah, so before we go too far, down any rabbit holes, let's just sort of ground ourselves a bit and ask, when we talk about human rights, what are we actually talking about? And, being a philosopher, I'm sure you're going to tell me it's not as straightforward as it sounds.
Well, you know me too. Well, sometimes these terms can be a bit slippery, and the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy actually highlights this. Human rights are really about securing for individuals certain freedoms, protections, status, immunities, and even benefits. They're essentially claims that one person has on another to deliver on these things.
So are we saying then that if someone has a right to something, they can just demand it and then boom, they get it?
Well, not necessarily. Human rights are often, enshrined in legal documents and treaties, but not all of them are directly enforceable in that kind of straightforward way. That you might imagine some function more as these high priority goals, things we as a society strive to guarantee for everyone. It's a bit more nuanced than a simple right to demand something.
Yeah, that makes sense because, I mean, I guess you can have a right to something like free speech, for example, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can just speak your mind freely,
Right.
without any fear of repercussions. The right exists, but how it actually plays out in the real world can be kind of messy.
Exactly. And that messiness is where a lot of the philosophical debate stems from. But to really navigate that debate, we need to understand some of the core characteristics of human rights. And the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy actually lays out four defining features that I think are very useful for us to kind of dig into.
Okay, let's hear them. I'm ready to unpack and analyze.
All right. So, first and foremost, perhaps the most obvious one is that human rights are, in fact, rights. They represent entitlements, claims, demands that individuals can make based solely on their being human. So think about recent events where people have protested unjust treatment or, asserted their freedom to express themselves. Those are human rights in action.
So they're not just like these lofty ideals, then they're actually supposed to have like real world implications.
Hmm. Precisely. And that brings us to the second feature, plurality. You see, human rights don't exist in isolation. They come in lists, addressing a wide range of human concerns to safeguard both individual and collective well-being. It's kind of like having a toolkit, with different tools for different jobs. Each right serves a specific purpose.
I like that analogy, the toolkit for humanity. But if we're talking about a toolkit for humanity, shouldn't everyone have access to this toolkit? So that where universality comes in, are there ever situations where a human right doesn't apply?
That's an excellent question. Universality, the third feature, means these rights should, in principle, apply to all persons equally, regardless of background. But, like you hinted at, there are some nuances. Certain rights, like voting, for example, have inherent limitations based on things like age or citizenship, even freedom of movement, which you think could be very straightforward, can be restricted in emergency situations. Think about lockdowns during a pandemic.
Oh, right. Or even property rights. I mean,
Yeah.
you can't just walk into someone's house and say, oh, this is mine now because I have a right to freedom of movement. I mean, there are always going to be limits, right?
Exactly. And sometimes those competing interests lead to some very difficult dilemmas. This is where that fourth feature, high priority, becomes particularly important. The philosopher Maurice Cranston actually argued that human rights violations represent grave affronts to justice. They hold a special weight, a moral urgency that demands attention.
But doesn't that priority get tricky when you're talking about things like national security versus privacy rights? I mean, we see this tension playing out in current events all the time, don't we?
Absolutely. And it underscores why understanding the philosophical foundations of human rights is so crucial. You need frameworks to help grapple with those tricky situations where even high priority rights might come into conflict with each other.
Yeah, it's not enough to just say, well, these are human rights and therefore they're important. You need to be able to actually explain why they're important and how they fit into this broader ethical framework.
Exactly. And that why is what we'll be exploring as we go forward. We'll be digging deeper into the justifications and the philosophical underpinning of these very human rights.
This is getting really interesting. I can't wait to dive in a little deeper.
Welcome back to our, exploration of human rights. We just talked about some of the basic features, but now I think it's time to kind of get into some of the deeper philosophical stuff.
Yeah, let's get philosophical. I mean,
Yeah.
one concept that's always kind of intrigued me is this idea that human rights are inalienable. Does that mean they can never be taken away no matter what happens?
Well, that's a question that philosophers have been grappling with for centuries. The term inalienable kind of suggests that these rights are, inherent and non-transferable, almost like they're part of our very being.
Yeah.
But the reality is, as you might expect, a bit more complicated than that.
Right, because, I mean, if you have someone who commits a serious crime and they're imprisoned, I mean, aren't they essentially losing their right to freedom of movement? Does that mean the right is alienable after all?
That's a great example you bring up. And you're right, imprisonment does restrict someone's movement, but it's generally seen as like a temporary measure, right? It's not a permanent revocation of the right itself. It's more accurate to say that inalienable rights are incredibly difficult to lose. They're resistant to trade-offs, but not completely immune from them. That's something that the philosopher Alan Griffin has argued.
So it's more like they're highly protected
Yeah.
rather than absolutely untouchable. But this kind of makes me think of another debate that often comes up, which is, this idea of expanding the list of human rights.
Mm.
Now, some people argue that we should have like a very short, focused list of core rights, and others say, no, we need to keep adding to the list as our understanding of human needs and dignity evolves. Isn't there a risk of diluting the power of human rights if we just keep adding more and more things to the list?
That is a valid concern. It's this classic tension between minimalism and expansion. Minimalists like the philosopher Michael Ignatieff, they argue that a limited set of truly fundamental rights is much more effective at preventing the worst kinds of abuses. They worry that an overly long list kind of weakens the urgency and the focus of human rights claims.
It's kind of like that saying, jack of all trades, master of none, right? If everything's a
Right.
human right, then does anything really have that special weight and urgency that we were talking about before with, Cranston's view?
Exactly. But then on the flip side, you have thinkers like Henry Shue who argue that new challenges and evolving understandings of human dignity necessitate adding new rights. So, for example, should we consider access to the internet to be a human right in our increasingly digital world? Or what about the right to a healthy environment given the urgency of climate change?
Those are definitely some compelling arguments. It seems like finding the right balance between protecting these core rights and, adapting to new realities is an ongoing challenge.
It definitely is, but even if we could agree on this like perfect list of human rights, there's still this fundamental question that remains. Where do these rights actually come from in the first place? Like, what is it about them that makes them so fundamental and, worthy of this special protection?
All right, so now we're really getting into like the deep philosophical stuff, this question of grounding
Aha.
has always fascinated me. Are human rights something we're born with, like an inherent part of our nature, or are they more like creations of human society, something we've kind of agreed upon through laws and treaties and things like that?
That's the big question, isn't it? The grounding of human rights is a topic of intense philosophical debate. Some argue that they're inherent to our being, stemming from our capacity for reason or moral agency, or simply just our shared humanity.
Yeah, I can see the appeal of that perspective. It just feels right to think that, our rights come from simply being human, not from some external authority or, legal document.
It's a very powerful idea. Others point to sources beyond human construction, like divine decrees or natural law, as this foundation for human rights. They see them as embedded in a higher moral order.
So we've got this spectrum then from inherent human nature to like a divinely ordained order. But what about the view that human rights are essentially like legal constructs? They exist because of agreements we've made as societies.
Right. That's another really important perspective to consider. Legal positivists would say that human rights exist primarily because of international treaties and national laws, and they emphasize the role of human institutions in defining and enforcing those rights.
So it's not about some abstract moral realm, then it's about these concrete systems that we put in place to, protect certain values and interests.
Precisely, but, regardless of which grounding you find most compelling, it still leads to another very crucial question. How do we actually justify human rights? Like, what makes them so important that they should trump other considerations, at least some of the time? And this is where I think the really interesting philosophical heavy lifting begins.
Right. Let's talk justifications then. Why should we even care about human rights? What makes them so special? what makes them deserving of this protection?
Well, there are a few prominent lines of argument, and they often intersect in interesting ways, but one really compelling argument emphasizes human agency and autonomy. This draws on the work of philosophers like Alan Garworth and Alan Griffin again, and they argue that our very capacity for making choices and setting goals and pursuing a meaningful life, that's really what gives us this inherent worth and dignity.
So our freedom to kind of shape our own destiny, to make our own choices, that's like the bedrock of human rights.
In a sense, yes, from this perspective, respecting human rights means respecting individuals as these autonomous agents capable of self-determination. It means protecting their freedom to live a life according to their own values and aspirations, as long as they don't infringe on the rights of others, of course.
That makes sense. But isn't there a danger in focusing too much on individual autonomy?
Hmm.
I mean, what about things like community social responsibility, collective well-being? I mean, don't those play a role in the justification of human rights as well?
Absolutely, and that's where I think this concept of human dignity really comes into play. While it's often intertwined with autonomy, dignity has its own very rich philosophical tradition, and you have thinkers like Immanuel Kant and Jeremy Waldron who have offered very compelling arguments for its centrality to human rights.
I've always found this concept of dignity a little bit slippery, to be
Yeah.
honest. It seems so subjective. What does it actually mean to treat someone with dignity?
It's true that dignity has been interpreted in many different ways, and that's led to disagreements. But at its core, it's about recognizing the inherent worth of every human being. It's about treating people with respect, regardless of their social status or their achievements, or even their moral choices.
So it's about seeing each person as valuable and deserving of consideration simply because they're human. It's like this fundamental respect that transcends any individual differences.
Exactly. And this idea of inherent worth, I think, really connects back to the justification for human rights. If each person has this intrinsic dignity, then certain basic rights become absolutely essential for protecting that dignity and ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to live a life that's actually worthy of their inherent value.
This is all very thought-provoking, but it feels like we're just scratching the surface here.
Yeah.
I mean, we haven't even talked about, like, the practical challenges of implementing human rights
Right.
in a world with, diverse cultures and political systems. And, how do we balance universal principles with local customs? And what about situations where rights seem to clash with each other? There's still so much to explore.
You're absolutely right. Those are exactly the questions that we'll be tackling next. So, stay tuned.
Okay, so, we've been talking a lot about, the philosophy behind human rights, the features, the grounding, the justifications. But now I kind of want to zoom out a little bit and talk about something that's been kind of bugging me this whole time. We talk about human rights being universal, right? But how can that be true when we live in a world with so many different cultures and belief systems? I mean, aren't there going to be times when certain rights just clash with deeply held traditions in certain societies?
That is a really crucial question, and it gets right to the heart of one of the biggest debates in human rights discourse, which is this tension between universalism and cultural relativism. And it's something that was recognized even as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was being drafted. Anthropologists at the time warned about imposing a Western-centric view of rights on cultures that might have different values.
Right. And we see this tension play out all the time in real-world situations.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, just think about that Asian values debate from the 1990s, where the argument was, emphasizing individual rights above things like communal harmony or deference to authority goes against, certain cultural traditions in some Asian societies.
Exactly. Proponents of that Asian values perspective argued that, Western human rights frameworks were just too individualistic, that they neglected the importance of family community and social stability. They saw it as a form of cultural imperialism, trying to impose alien norms on societies with different conceptions of what the good life looks like.
So how do we reconcile this tension then? I mean, is it even possible to have truly universal rights when you have cultures with such vastly different beliefs about morality,
Yeah.
Individual autonomy, the role of society? I mean, I'm genuinely struggling with this one.
It's a tough one for sure. And there are no easy answers, but there are different approaches. One strategy is to try and formulate human rights in a more abstract way, allowing for, diverse implementations based on cultural context. So, for example, the right to education might look very different in a rural village compared to, a bustling city.
So it's like having like a general blueprint that you can kind of adapt to the local landscape.
Precisely. It allows for some flexibility while still upholding that core principle of the right. Another approach is to acknowledge what the European Court of Human Rights calls a margin of appreciation. It's basically recognizing that states have some leeway in how they apply human rights based on, their specific social and cultural conditions.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. But doesn't that also kind of open the door for governments to, cherry pick which rights they want to actually uphold and which ones they can just conveniently ignore?
Yeah.
Couldn't this margin of appreciation become a bit of a loophole for, human rights abuses?
That's a very valid concern, and it's why this whole debate around cultural relativism and human rights is so contentious.
Hmm.
I think the key is finding that balance, right, between respecting cultural differences on the one hand, while also ensuring that certain fundamental rights are protected for everyone, regardless of where they live or what they believe.
Sounds like a bit of a tightrope walk to me. How do we make sure that this respect for diversity doesn't end up becoming a license for oppression?
Well, the 1993 World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna actually addressed this very concern. They emphasized that all human rights are universal, indivisible, and interdependent. They rejected this idea of selectively upholding some rights while ignoring others. They basically said, look, the implementation might vary, but the core principles themselves, those are non-negotiable.
But even with those safeguards in place, I mean, there's still going to be some gray areas, right? Situations where deeply entrenched cultural practices just clash with universal human rights norms, and it feels like finding a solution that respects both sides is almost impossible.
You're absolutely right. There are definitely some really tough cases out there, and those are the ones that require, dialogue, understanding, and some very careful ethical considerations to try and find a way forward. I mean, take, for example, the issue of female genital mutilation. It's a practice that's deeply rooted in some cultures, but it's also widely condemned as a violation of women's rights under international law. I mean, that's where the conversation gets really, really challenging. And there's just no easy answer, no one-size-fits-all solution.
It really makes you realize that this whole idea of universal human rights isn't just some theoretical debate. It has very real consequences for people's lives and well-being.
It absolutely does, and it brings us right back to this question of grounding.
Right.
If we're going to claim that certain rights are truly universal, they can't just be based on the values of one particular culture or one historical period. So I think the search for a solid cross-cultural foundation for human rights has to continue.
So where do we go from here then? What are some of the most promising avenues for finding that kind of universal grounding? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, some philosophers like Martha Nussbaum have proposed a capabilities approach, which focuses on what all humans need to really flourish, to live a life worthy of dignity, regardless of their cultural background. It emphasizes the importance of making sure that everyone has the opportunity to develop their capabilities and, make choices about how they want to live.
That resonates with me, actually. It feels like it kind of bridges the gap between individual autonomy and collective well-being, right? It's recognizing both the inherent worth of the individual, but also the importance of creating social conditions that allow everyone to thrive.
Right, and others, like Ronald Dworkin, emphasize the inherent equality of all persons. They argue that equal concern and respect are really the basis for universal rights. So from this perspective, human rights are about ensuring that everyone is treated with the same level of consideration, regardless of their differences.
It sounds like there's no easy answer here. But the fact that we're having these conversations, that we're wrestling with these complex questions, it gives me hope.
Yeah.
It shows that we're taking the idea of human rights seriously, not just as some lofty ideal, but as a framework for actually building a more just and equitable world.
I agree. And as our world becomes increasingly interconnected, these conversations are only going to become more important. So we need to keep striving for that framework that respects cultural differences while also upholding the fundamental dignity and worth of every human being.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive. It's made me realize just how much philosophical depth there is to this concept of human rights, something we often just take for granted. I have a feeling I'll be thinking about these questions long after we're done here today.
Me too. And I'll leave you with one final thought. Imagine you were tasked with drafting a human rights declaration for a brand new society. What principles would guide your selections? What rights would you prioritize? And how would you navigate those inevitable tensions between individual freedoms, collective well-being, and, cultural diversity?
Wow, that's quite the challenge. It really makes you appreciate the complexities involved in trying to create a just and equitable world.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining me on this incredibly thought-provoking journey.
It's been my pleasure. And to all our listeners out there, we encourage you to keep exploring this ever-evolving landscape of human rights because it's a conversation that really requires our constant attention and engagement.